Let's talk about ethics in business here. And some people would call that maybe an oxymoron, kind of like military intelligence, especially when we talk about the law part of business. But anyhow, double jeopardy is a concept that we'll talk about a little bit later, but I thought it was kind of a funny thing here that maybe dealt a little bit with ethics as well. Some older articles, maybe we could go look those up. But Barbara Tuchman was a gal who was kind of, she was a writer and a journalist. She won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes. She was kind of renowned for her knowledge of history, even though she was not a formally trained historian. She was more of a writer and whatnot, but she studied and wrote about history enough that she was considered kind of an expert on it. And she wrote, that we're suffering from a loss of a moral sense, right? The difference, knowing the difference between right and wrong. And she wrote this years ago, and my problem with that is that I think that's something that each generation says, and we say it about the next generation oftentimes coming up, and yet, all the evidence would kind of say otherwise, that no, we do have pretty good senses of right and wrong, and it seems to be getting better actually over time if you look at the evidence on those things. And so nevertheless, each generation says that about the upcoming generation, saying, kids today, they don't know what they're doing, on and on and on, right? Oliver Wendell Holmes, of course, was a Supreme Court justice, and he said the law, is the external witness and external deposit. So he's saying that laws are based on morals, and even though people have been quoted as saying that you can't legislate morality, the truth is exactly the opposite, that we always legislate morality, and stealing, right? Stealing's a moral issue, and if you lived in certain societies, there's no such thing as stealing, right? Because all property might be communal, and yet we make laws against stealing, right? Because we feel that is a moral or ethical issue in this nation. It deals with property and property rights, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. So ethics in society and what's happened in society. And one of the things we have had a breakdown in the family structure, and that the evidence is clear on that we do have far more single-parent families than we did 30, 40, 50 years ago, far more. Statistics I listened to, one of my favorite economists, Thomas Sowell, he talks about African-American families, and in the late 50s and real early 60s, about 70% were intact family units, mother, father, and children, and here we are in today's day and age, and that number's down to about 28%, I believe, is the number he uses. And so, the family structure has changed dramatically in the last several decades, and we have tried to rely on our public education maybe to fill in those gaps. And that's kind of what this is talking about, and public education may not be the place for that to happen. We also have economic interdependence now. 100 years ago, people lived on farms. They raised their own food. They hardly went to the store for anything, maybe a little salt and sugar and a few other things, but they weren't largely dependent on other places, for their goods or services, either one. And today we're totally economic and interdependent, right? Do you know anybody that raises all their own? You might look at some of the Hutterite colonies around and say that they're, they have a certain amount of interdependence, but today most of us are very, very interdependent, or we depend on others for those types of things. We all specialize. We're good at one thing or another, and we let the people that are good at growing fruit grow fruit, and we go buy it from our local supermarket or Walmart, right? And the news media and the internet, and this is what I find to be very interesting, because I think today we suffer from too much information. Again, decades ago, if something happened in Washington, D.C., maybe a horrible serial killer was on the loose or something, it might be weeks before we even heard about it in Montana, and it would probably be in an article maybe in the newspaper. today we might get an alert on our phone that tells us about something tragic that's happened in New York or LA or wherever the case may be. And I think because of that, we sometimes feel like society's far more dangerous today than in days past. And the truth is the exact opposite. We're living in the safest time known to mankind. We've even earlier in the last century, millions of people were killed oftentimes for their beliefs from within nations, not even counting the world wars and other wars that we had. That just doesn't, it's not happening to that degree now, at least not the millions of people. There's still despots and awful things going around, but not like there was. And murders and those types of things are actually down from decades ago. And yet, as we watch the media and see things on the internet, we think that, the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket, and the truth is it's not. Now, that would be the truth. That'll stump a lawyer, any lawyer, I guess. Insider trading enforcement actions. This is kind of the business side of things that the SEC does. They track people that do insider trading. And honestly, there haven't been a lot of high-profile cases on this here in the last few years. There was for a while. I think enforcement people, sometimes these things ebb and flow. Sometimes they make examples, and then maybe it dies down for a while. But there were some high-profile cases a decade ago that have now, they've gone into the past. I'll show you one here in a bit. It wasn't really insider trading, but they've kind of diminished, and so we don't read about it. There's still some that happen, probably fairly consistently. Probably the numbers are fairly similar, but they're not as high profile. Maybe smaller amounts, those types of things that are happening. So some SEC investigations, and you can go to the SEC site and see what's ongoing. You'll find hundreds of them. They're ongoing, and again, some of them are small. Some of them are just going to be actions that the SEC handles and gets over with, and they sign a consent decree, and that's all we hear about it. And unless we're really studying it or unless we're involved, we don't really know. But there's higher profile ones. There's a movie out not too long ago about Bernie Madoff. I can't remember that. Richard Dreyfuss, I think, starred in it as Bernie Madoff, and he was his wasn't insider trading. His was a pyramid scheme. He basically ran a pyramid scheme, and it was interesting. They say that his investors lost, up to I think it was $64 billion. The truth is that isn't what they invested, but that's what he was showing them their accounts were worth, even though there was no money to back that up, because he was running kind of a pyramid scheme. Interesting that he could have got away with it for as long as he did. When the stock market collapsed, in the last recession, 2007, 2008, that's when it all came apart. Wells Fargo, I put them down just because of the account scandal, that they've had lately, and the ethics and morality that surrounds that account scandal. I think that's one of those issues that's current that maybe we can get our hands around a little bit and talk about and say, it's one of those things where they created a policy, and their intent for the policy was not what ended up happening. They were encouraging, forcefully kind of encouraging their employees to open new accounts. Well, of course, what they meant was they wanted employees to get out and get new customers and get them to come in, and they based their compensation and promotions and actually, if you wanted to keep your job, you brought in new accounts, right? And what ended up happening was the pressures got so intense that employees then opened up fake accounts. And I think recent stats shows maybe 1.5 million fake accounts that were opened up. Well, how does that hurt anybody? Well, it gave compensation and whatnot to some of those employees. Some of the accounts maybe were opened up in maybe using your data and you didn't even know it. If you had a checking account, they might open up a savings account in your name and whatnot, and boom, there it was, but you didn't even know about it. Might again not cause any real harm. They probably opened up things like credit cards, accounts, and those types of things using your information that became, a little bit problematic. And so a lot of people lost their jobs too because of the account thing. Maybe they either they got caught opening up these accounts, or it was pervasive. In other words, it was one of these underlying things that was happening, and Joe was telling Betty, and so Betty was doing it, and then she was telling Todd, and then he was doing it, and then he was telling Martha, and she did it, and it took a long time, and obviously if they opened up that many accounts for management to find out. As a consequence, the CEO was gone. He's been he's off. He's been basically fired. He resigned. They've been brought before Congress and whatnot, and so nasty stuff. And again, it wasn't a case where they intentionally went out to do those types of things. It just they had bad policy, right? And here we go, policy versus ethics here. And it was bad, and maybe bad policy is the wrong word. It was bad follow-up. Bad. Keeping track of what the policy was causing, what it was creating, and maybe not acting soon enough when they found that there were some discrepancies. So you go back to the old Enron scandal, and this one's getting old. A lot of you may not or would have just been infants probably when the Enron scandal was going on. It's lengthy. It would take me a long time to tell you about it. So contemporary business ethics, and I think I'll stop. I'll pause for now, and we'll start again here in a bit with the second slide. I've gone for a little over 10 minutes. So.